The cabin buzzed with the hum of conversations and the rhythmic drone of the plane's engines. Passengers were settling in for what seemed like an uneventful flight. The flight attendants, dressed in crisp uniforms, moved gracefully through the aisles, offering snacks and reassuring smiles. Among them was Claire, a seasoned professional with years of experience in the skies. She had seen it all: nervous first-time flyers, cranky children, even a surprise proposal at 35,000 feet. But today felt different, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. Near the middle of the plane sat a young girl, no older than 10, her dark curls framing her serious face. She clutched a small notebook, her fingers fidgeting over its edges. Her eyes darted around, observing every movement with a quiet intensity that seemed unusual for someone her age. Claire noticed the girl but thought little of it. Kids often had their quirks. Still, something about her demeanor lingered in the back of Claire's mind. As the plane ascended and leveled out, passengers began to relax. Laptops opened, movies played, and the faint smell of coffee filled the cabin. Claire was making her rounds, ensuring everyone was comfortable, when the girl suddenly stood up. Her small frame moved quickly and determinedly toward Claire, catching her off guard. The girl extended her hand, holding a folded piece of paper. "For you," she said softly, her voice steady but filled with an urgency that made Claire pause. "What's this?" Claire asked, taking the note cautiously. "Just read it," the girl replied, her dark eyes locking onto Claire's with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. Before Claire could respond, the girl turned and walked briskly back to her seat, sinking into it as if nothing had happened. Claire unfolded the paper, her heart inexplicably racing. The handwriting was uneven, the kind you'd expect from a child, but the words made her breath catch. It wasn't a harmless doodle or a sweet note like she'd anticipated. Instead, it was a message that sent her pulse into overdrive. She looked around the cabin, her eyes scanning for any signs of danger or abnormal behavior. Everything seemed normal, too normal. Claire's mind raced as she clutched the note tighter. Should she call the captain? Alert the crew? Her training dictated calm in the face of uncertainty, but the urgency of the girl's tone and the cryptic nature of the message unsettled her. Claire leaned toward a fellow flight attendant, discreetly showing her the note. A colleague's eyes widened, and she whispered, "We need to notify the captain. Now." As Claire moved toward the cockpit, her hands trembling slightly, the girl watched from her seat, her expression unreadable. The other passengers remained oblivious to the growing tension among the crew. Claire knew she had to act quickly but carefully. The stakes were high, and every decision she made could determine the outcome. When she reached the cockpit, she handed the note to the captain without a word. His face, calm and composed, changed as he read it. His eyes darted to the crew and then back to the note. Without hesitation, he grabbed the intercom and announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts. We're making an unscheduled landing. Flight attendants, prepare for descent." The cabin erupted into murmurs and confused whispers. Claire's heart pounded as she returned to her station. What had started as an ordinary flight had turned into a mystery with no clear resolution in sight. She glanced back at the girl, who now sat quietly, her face betraying no emotion. Who was she? What was in that note? And why had it caused such an immediate and drastic response? The answers were out there, but for now, the only certainty was that this flight was far from routine. As the plane began its descent, Claire braced herself for what awaited them on the ground, her mind swirling with questions and a sense of dread she couldn't shake. The plane's descent was swift and deliberate, each second filled with a weighty silence that pressed down on everyone on board. Passengers exchanged nervous glances, whispering speculations about the unexpected change in plans. Some thought it might be mechanical issues. Others wondered if it was a medical emergency. No one seemed to suspect the real reason, except for the small girl seated quietly in the middle row. Her hands rested on her lap, but her posture was stiff, her gaze fixed on the seat back in front of her. She hadn't moved or spoken since handing over the note. Claire, despite her years of experience, couldn't shake the unease clawing at her chest. Every instinct told her this was no ordinary situation. The captain had given her a brief, grim nod before locking the cockpit door, signaling that whatever was happening was serious. Her colleague Sarah, standing nearby, leaned in and whispered, "What did the note say? Did you see?" Claire hesitated. Not everything, she admitted, lowering her voice further. But it mentioned something about danger. It wasn't clear, but it was enough for the captain to act immediately. Sarah's brow furrowed, her lips pressing into a thin line. At the girl? Did she say anything else? No, Claire replied, glancing toward the child again. She just handed it to me and went back to her seat like nothing happened. But she knew it was going to cause this. Do you think she's alone? Sarah asked, her eyes scanning the passengers. Claire shrugged. I didn't see anyone with her when she boarded, but someone that young. There's got to be an adult traveling with her. We should find out. With that, the two attendants began a quiet, discreet sweep of the cabin, checking the manifest against the faces of the passengers. Claire approached the girl again, kneeling beside her seat. Hi there, she began softly, offering a warm smile. I just wanted to check in and make sure you're okay. The girl looked at her, her dark eyes calm but piercing. I'm fine, she said simply. Are you traveling alone? Claire asked, keeping her tone gentle. The girl hesitated, then nodded. Yes. Do you have someone waiting for you when we land? Claire pressed, trying to piece together some semblance of context. My aunt, the girl replied, her voice steady but devoid of the usual nervousness Claire expected from a child in such a situation. Claire nodded, choosing her words carefully. And the note you gave me, can you tell me a little more about why you wrote it? The girl's expression hardened, and she glanced around as if ensuring no one was eavesdropping. Leaning slightly toward Claire, she said in a low voice, You'll understand soon. Just make sure everyone stays calm. The cryptic response sent another wave of unease through Claire. She nodded slowly, deciding not to push further. For now, her priority was keeping the passengers calm and cooperating with the captain. She stood, her heart heavy with unanswered questions, and returned to her station. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, the captain was coordinating with air traffic control for an emergency landing at the nearest airport. His co-pilot, a younger man named Jake, glanced at him nervously. What do you think this is about, Captain? I don't know, the captain admitted, his eyes focused on the controls. But the note was clear enough. We can't take any chances. What exactly did it say? Jake pressed, his voice barely above a whisper. The captain hesitated before repeating the key phrases, something about a threat on board, and a warning to land immediately. No details, but the tone. It didn't feel like a prank. Jake nodded, his jaw tightening. Let's just hope we're overreacting. Back in the cabin, the tension was palpable. The usual hum of conversation had dwindled into an eerie quiet, interrupted only by the occasional cough or rustle of clothing. Claire and Sarah continued to check on passengers, offering reassurances that they didn't quite feel themselves. Every now and then, Claire's eyes would drift back to the girl, who remained as composed as ever. A man seated a few rows ahead leaned toward Claire as she passed. Excuse me, he said in a low voice. Is everything okay? Should we be worried? Claire forced a reassuring smile. We're just taking a precautionary landing, sir. There's nothing to be alarmed about. The man didn't look convinced but nodded, sinking back into his seat. Claire knew the passenger's patience was wearing thin. If the situation wasn't resolved soon, panic could spread, and that was the last thing they needed. As the plane neared the airport, the girl finally moved. She reached into her small backpack and pulled out another piece of paper, folding it neatly before standing up. Claire noticed immediately and approached her, her heart pounding. Another note. Claire asked, her voice barely steady. The girl nodded, handing it over without a word. Claire unfolded it quickly, her eyes scanning the words. This time, the message was even shorter but just as unsettling. It's almost time. Claire's stomach dropped. She exchanged a look with Sarah, who had read over her shoulder. We need to tell the captain, Sarah whispered, her voice shaky. As the plane descended into the airport, the weight of the mystery bore down on everyone. Claire handed the new note to the captain, who read it with a grim expression before tightening his grip on the controls. Let's get this bird on the ground, he said firmly. The plane touched down with an unsettling jolt, the runway lights streaking past the windows as the engines roared during the rapid deceleration. The passengers jolted out of their anxious silence, exchanged worried looks, some clutching their armrests as if bracing for something far worse. Claire remained at her post near the galley, her pulse racing as the plane slowed to a stop on a secluded section of the tarmac. It was clear now that this wasn't an ordinary landing. Outside the window, flashing blue and red lights approached, accompanied by a convoy of vehicles. The airfield staff and emergency responders seemed unusually coordinated, their movements sharp and purposeful. Claire's eyes darted back to the young girl, who still sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't even glance out the window, her composure unnerving. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, for your safety, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Authorities will be boarding the plane shortly for a routine inspection. Routine? Claire almost scoffed. There was nothing routine about this. She turned to Sarah, who was biting her lip nervously. "They're not telling the passengers everything," Sarah murmured, her voice barely audible. "They can't," Claire whispered back. "Not until they know what's going on." The girl suddenly shifted in her seat, leaning forward slightly as the first of the emergency personnel stepped onto the aircraft. Two men in dark uniforms, accompanied by an air marshal who had been sitting incognito near the back of the plane, approached the flight crew. They spoke in hushed tones, their expressions grim. Claire couldn't hear the specifics of the conversation, but the urgency in their gestures was unmistakable. One of the officials turned toward the cabin, scanning the rows of passengers with a sharp, assessing gaze. His eyes landed on the girl, and his expression flickered. Surprise, maybe recognition. He whispered something to the air marshal, who nodded before approaching the girl. "Excuse me, miss," he said gently, kneeling to meet her eye level. "We'd like to ask you a few questions." The girl glanced at Claire before answering. "Am I in trouble?" "No," the marshal replied quickly. "But we need your help to make sure everyone is safe." She hesitated, then nodded. As she stood, Claire noticed for the first time how small she seemed, dwarfed by the presence of the adults around her. Yet there was something in her posture, a confidence, a self-assuredness, that didn't match her age. The marshal guided her toward the front of the plane, where the officials were waiting. The tension in the cabin was palpable. Passengers whispered amongst themselves, some speculating wildly, others demanding answers from the crew. Claire tried to maintain her composure, offering reassurances that felt increasingly hollow. She stole glances toward the front of the plane, where the girl was now speaking softly with the officials. Whatever she was saying seemed to carry weight. They leaned in, their expressions shifting between concern and disbelief. Meanwhile, at the back of the plane, an entirely different scene was unfolding. A man in his mid-40s, seated near the lavatories, was fidgeting with his carry-on bag. His movements were subtle but deliberate, his gaze darting nervously toward the authorities at the front. Sarah noticed him first, nudging Claire discreetly. "Do you see that?" she whispered. Claire followed Sarah's gaze, her stomach tightening as she observed the man's erratic behavior. "We need to tell the marshal," she said, her voice low but firm. Before they could act, the man suddenly stood, clutching his bag tightly. The movement drew the attention of nearby passengers, some of whom gasped audibly. Claire stepped forward instinctively, blocking his path. "Sir, I need you to return to your seat," she said, her tone firm despite the fear gripping her chest. I just need to use the restroom," the man stammered, his eyes avoiding hers. "Sir, please sit down," Sarah added, her voice shaking slightly. "The authorities will address any concerns you have." The man hesitated, his grip tightening on the bag. For a moment, it seemed as though he might comply. Then, without warning, he bolted toward the aisle, pushing past passengers and crew alike. Chaos erupted as passengers screamed and scrambled to get out of his way. The marshal and officials at the front reacted immediately, rushing down the aisle to intercept him. Claire's heart pounded as she watched the scene unfold. The girl, still standing near the cockpit, seemed unfazed. In fact, there was a flicker of recognition in her expression as she watched the man struggle against the authorities. It was as if she had been expecting this all along. The man was subdued quickly, his bag confiscated and searched by the officials. Whatever they found inside caused one of them to pale visibly. He muttered something into his radio, prompting a flurry of activity outside the plane. Emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft, their lights casting eerie reflections on the cabin walls. Claire exchanged a glance with Sarah, both of them too stunned to speak. The girl was escorted back to her seat, her calm demeanor unbroken. Claire knelt beside her again, her voice trembling. "Do you know what's going on?" The girl looked at her, her dark eyes filled with a wisdom far beyond her years. "I told you," she said softly. "You'll understand soon." For Claire, those words only deepened the mystery. As the man was led off the plane in handcuffs, and the authorities began questioning the passengers, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something far larger than any of them could comprehend. The atmosphere inside the plane was electric with unease, every passenger hyper-aware of their surroundings. The authorities had retreated to the front, their conversation urgent but inaudible. Claire kept glancing at the girl, now seated again but still unnervingly calm. The man who had caused the destruction was long gone, escorted off the plane in handcuffs, but his actions had left a deep imprint on everyone. Whispers filled the cabin, speculation growing wilder with each passing minute. Claire couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in her gut. The girl knew more than she was letting on. That much was clear, but what she knew and how she knew it remained a mystery. Claire hesitated and decided to approach her again. She crouched beside the girl's seat, her voice low but firm. "Listen, sweetie, I need you to be honest with me. What's going on? Is there something we need to be afraid of?" The girl looked at her with the same steady gaze as before, but this time Claire noticed a flicker of something else. Hesitation, maybe even fear. "It's not over yet," the girl whispered. "You need to be ready." "Ready for what?" Claire pressed, her voice cracking slightly. "Please tell me." Before the girl could answer, the captain's voice came over the intercom again. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We ask that you remain in your seats as the situation is still being assessed. Additional safety measures are being taken." The announcement did little to ease anyone's nerves. In fact, it only heightened the tension. The passengers were on edge, their anxiety turning into frustration. A man in the aisle seat a few rows back stood up, his voice loud and demanding. "We deserve to know what's going on. What kind of safety measures are you talking about?" Other passengers chimed in, their voices overlapping in a chaotic chorus of questions and complaints. Claire tried to calm them, raising her hands in a placating gesture. "Please, everyone, stay seated. We're doing everything we can to ensure your safety." But the unrest was spreading, and it became clear that words alone wouldn't be enough to quell it. Sarah hurried to the intercom, her voice trembling as she made a desperate announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm and seated. The authorities are handling the situation, and we need your cooperation." In the midst of the growing chaos, the girl stood again, her small frame almost lost in the sea of agitation. Yet her presence commanded attention. Claire noticed immediately and moved toward her, but before she could reach her, the girl spoke, her voice clear and steady. "It's not safe yet," she said, her words cutting through the noise. "They're still here." The cabin fell silent, her cryptic statement hanging in the air like a dark cloud. Claire felt her heart race as she tried to process what the girl meant. Still here? Who was she referring to? Suddenly, a muffled sound came from one of the overhead bins, a faint but distinct thud. Heads turned toward the source, passengers frozen in their seats. Claire's breath hitched as she exchanged a panicked glance with Sarah. One of the officials at the front barked an order, and the air marshal rushed toward the bin, his hand hovering near his concealed weapon. The marshal reached up, his movements cautious as he unlatched the bin. It swung open, revealing an unremarkable carry-on bag. He unzipped it slowly, his body tense, and pulled out a small, blinking device. Gasps erupted from the passengers as the marshal shouted for everyone to stay back. The officials hurried over, their expressions grim as they examined the device. One of them pulled out a radio, speaking rapidly into it. Claire could only catch snippets. Secondary threat, containment, immediate evacuation. The panic in the cabin was palpable now. Passengers were crying, clutching each other, some shouting in fear. Claire did her best to maintain order, but her own fear was making it difficult to think clearly. She looked at the girl, who remained eerily composed amidst the chaos. "Do you know what this is?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. The girl nodded slowly. "It's a distraction." Claire stared at her, her mind racing. A distraction? From what? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden blare of alarms from outside the plane. Emergency vehicles were repositioning, their lights casting frantic shadows across the cabin. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, strained but commanding. "We are initiating an emergency evacuation. Follow the instructions of the crew immediately." The cabin erupted into chaos as passengers scrambled to unbuckle their seatbelts and reach the exits. Claire and Sarah moved quickly, guiding people toward the inflatable slides that were being deployed outside. The officials remained focused on the device, their urgency growing by the second. As Claire helped a young mother and a child toward the exit, she glanced back at the girl. She was still seated, watching the scene unfold with an intensity that sent chills down Claire's spine. "Come on," Claire called to her. "We have to go." The girl stood but didn't move toward the exit. Instead, she looked directly at Claire and said, "They're not outside. They're still on the plane." Claire froze, her mind reeling. Before she could respond, the lights in the cabin flickered, and a deafening sound reverberated through the aircraft. The real threat had just revealed itself. The cabin plunged into chaos as the deafening sound reverberated through the plane, leaving passengers clutching their ears. The flickering lights cast eerie shadows, distorting faces filled with terror. Claire instinctively shielded herself, her heart pounding as the ominous noise faded into a foreboding silence. The girl's cryptic warning, "They're still on the plane," echoed in her mind, fueling a new wave of fear. What did she mean? And why hadn't she evacuated yet? The officials were shouting commands now, their voices sharp with urgency. One of them pointed toward the rear of the plane, signaling for the air marshal to investigate. Claire saw the marshal tense, his hand hovering over his holstered weapon as he began to move. Passengers huddled together, their panicked whispers forming an unsettling backdrop. Suddenly, a loud crash came from the back of the plane. The marshal froze, his head snapping toward the sound. It wasn't the clatter of shifting luggage or the result of turbulence. It was deliberate, calculated. Someone, or something, was moving. "Stay here," the marshal barked at Claire and the other flight attendants before disappearing down the aisle. Claire's instincts screamed at her to follow, but she knew her priority was keeping the remaining passengers calm. She turned to Sarah, whose face was pale with fear. "Help me guide them off the plane," Claire urged, her voice shaking but resolute. As they worked to usher people toward the emergency exits, another noise emerged, this time a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the aircraft. Claire froze, her breath hitching as she scanned the cabin. The sound didn't seem human or animal. It was something else entirely. Her gaze landed on the girl, who stood motionless in the aisle, staring toward the source of the noise with unnerving calm. "What's happening?" Claire demanded, rushing to her side. "What do you know?" The girl's eyes met hers, and for the first time, Claire saw genuine fear flicker across her expression. "It's not him," she whispered cryptically. "It's them." Before Claire could press further, the marshal's voice rang out from the rear. "Everyone down." The urgency in his tone sent a ripple of panic through the remaining passengers, many of whom ducked instinctively. Claire grabbed the girl, pulling her toward the nearest row of seats for cover. Seconds later, the marshal reappeared, his face pale and his weapon drawn. "We got a serious situation," he said, his voice tight. "This isn't just a threat. It's an attack." The word hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Claire's mind raced as she tried to piece together what was happening. Was this connected to the man they had arrested earlier? The device found in the overhead bin? And how did the girl fit into all of it? The girl suddenly broke free of Claire's grasp, stepping forward with a resolve that seemed impossible for someone her age. "It's too late to stop them," she said, her voice steady despite the growing chaos. "But we can still survive, if we act now." Her words sent a shiver down Claire's spine. The girl wasn't just a passenger. She was central to whatever was happening. And for reasons Claire couldn't begin to understand, she trusted her. "What do we need to do?" Claire asked, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. The girl turned toward her, her eyes narrowing as if assessing whether Claire was ready for the truth. "Get everyone out of here," she said. "Now, they're not after the passengers." "Who are they after?" Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The girl hesitated, then replied in a tone so quiet it was almost inaudible. "Me." Claire's stomach dropped. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was too terrifying to comprehend. The noise, the destructions, the coordinated response. It wasn't random. It was a hunt, and this girl was the prey. Before Claire could respond, the growling sound intensified, this time accompanied by a metallic screech that echoed through the cabin. The air marshal shouted for backup, but his voice was drowned out by a deafening crash as a section of the rear wall buckled inward. Whatever was coming had arrived. Passengers screamed, scrambling toward the exits as the evacuation escalated into a full-blown stampede. Claire grabbed the girl's hand, pulling her toward the nearest slide. "We have to go now," she shouted. But the girl resisted, planting her feet firmly on the ground. "If I leave, they'll follow," she said. "They won't stop until they get what they want." Claire's mind raced, torn between the instinct to protect the girl and the need to get the remaining passengers to safety. She looked at the girl, searching her face for answers. What do they want? The girl's gaze was unflinching. Not what? Who? Claire's heart sank as the truth dawned on her. The girl wasn't just a bystander in this nightmare. She was the key, and whatever was coming for her wouldn't stop until they had her. Another crash jolted Claire back to the present, the sound of tearing metal sending shockwaves through the cabin. The marshal fired his weapon into the darkness, but his shouts of defiance were quickly drowned out by the unearthly roar that followed. Claire knew they were out of time. "Come on," she said, gripping the girl's hand tightly. We'll figure this out, but we have to survive first." As they made their way toward the emergency exit, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that the real danger hadn't even begun.